Our study of the synthesis of yoga has taken a different approach than is common to such studies of Sri Aurobindo's writings. In many cases, you will find it more convenient when studying to summarize. You read a sentence, often with a very complex structure, with multiple secondary and tertiary, even many levels of hierarchies of ideas. And because the mind is unable to grasp it all in one go, one tries to summarize to say, what does he say in this sentence? And the same thing done on the scale of a paragraph or even at the scale of a chapter. And then we have a sense that we understand the broad line of what Sri Aurobindo is presenting. I heard some years ago from one of the students in the ashram school then, who is now an adult, even quite an aged person now, that as a student he used to attend classes in the ashram school studying Sri Aurobindo's Life Divine, where the teacher went through a similar process of summarizing. And at the end of the class, this young boy felt something was wrong. After many classes, when he had occasion to meet the mother, he complained to the mother that when we study Sri Aurobindo like this, I have the sense that I understand everything that he is saying, but I wonder also, why does he take so many words to say something so simple? I've understood what he's saying, it's simple enough, I could have thought of it, and the whole magic and the mystery and the sense of wonder that I had of Sri Aurobindo's writings, that is gone. Reading by himself, there was the sense of the magic of something unfolding, something revealing, something deepening, something awakening. But passing through the class, it was just raw ideas presented in a very rational way with nothing of that magic. And so when he complained to the mother took it very seriously. She informed the teacher of that class that hereafter this young boy was to study on his own and he would not be attending the class. And so subsequently for the rest of the years he studied on his own. And while that kind of approach has its value because it helps us to understand rationally, to be able to summarize in a few words the broad strokes, it misses the richness, the fullness, even the joy which we feel when reading in depth. And so our approach in these classes has been the very opposite to go deep. And we consider each word, we consider each phrase, and the turn of word, the turn of phrase, all the associations which come with it. And we study it in the same style in which Sri Aurobindo studies the Upanishads or the Veda, where he points out that nothing is said unnecessarily. Even if there is a repetition of a word, after several verses, the same word repeated, it is intended to provoke a connection in the mind. By a resonance of the same term, it is intended to awaken to the mind a link between those two verses at that point. A particular word not used at all is intended to evoke a different sense, and so on. And when we look at Sri Aurobindo's writings, we find not only a master linguist. Remember, he knew about more than a dozen languages, having mastered most of them almost. And he used to write, as in his teenage, he used to write poetry in ancient Greek, ancient Latin, New French, and the whole etymology of the vocabulary, the unfolding of the words and their meanings, and the layers in which they hold meaning across the ages as they develop through various languages. All that was part of his consciousness. As far as the European languages was concerned, especially English. And then when he came to India at the age of 21, he, with the same skill, with the same penetrating power, entered into Bengali, Gujarati, Sanskrit, and subsequently, of course, Hindi, Marathi, Tamil. He had equally exposure of Arabic and Persian. And all these he knew from their root sounds outwards, as if he held the secret of language itself. And so when he uses a particular word or a phrase, there are deep resonances and suggestions which are implied intentionally. And when he places a sentence in a complex structure, in a complex hierarchy of ideas, they capture not only the relationship of these ideas, but they also capture the nature of the experience and the relationship of the different facets within the experience. And all of this comes from a consciousness which is holding the experience as he articulates it. And so the mantric power is inherent in the text, and if we read it with that intention, we will even find reading and dwelling on his words, one tends to be pulled into the experience, as deep as one can be in that moment according to our readiness. So our approach has been to go in depth, to go into these fine nuances as far as we are able to within our own limitations. And necessarily it means we take time and we do not cover text rapidly. And the time is useful because it also helps us to internalize the ideas, the experiences, and the shift that they bring in our consciousness as we look upon the world from a different perspective. We grow, we change, and we allow time for that growth to stabilize in us. The result is, as the mother explains, by reading Sri Aurobindo, the brain cells grow. Now at a very physical level, the brain cells grow. But at a psychological level, your whole perspective of the world, even of yourself, your sense of identity and relationship with the world undergoes rapid shifts. The combined result of this is your ability to grasp, your ability to receive, your ability to enter the experience that he is describing also grows. And it's the reason why we can reread the text after a few years and find so much more that we did not perceive the first time that we read, and keep doing this again and again. In his consciousness, because he presents it from a perspective which is so wide and so complete, we can go on each time ascending in each reading to a higher and higher perspective and even level of experience and consciousness. The result being, a text like this can continue to unfold deeper insights and take us all the way to the highest poise from which he has written it. In the immediate passage that we have been studying, Sri Aurobindo has now turned to how the mind and the mental being can arrive at an integral realization of the divine in all the facets in which we can know the divine. And here he points out that there are two broad approaches in which this integration of the experience can take place. The first, which we read last time, where he refers to the approach seen in the Rig Veda and the Upanishads, is one of a kind of an inclusive process of self-enlargement and transformation, by which one takes up a little bit and a little bit, integrates it with the rest of all that we are, rises again to a new level, integrates, rises again to a new level, integrating, and so on, building, growing, widening in consciousness, taking into himself the action of the lower grades of being as he ascends. But what are you realizing at each step? The Satchidananda, the oneness which is the source of it all, is not known here. But we know it by its representation on this level as the conscious soul and nature soul, Purusha and Prakriti, in this double poise that the Satchidananda takes in the consciousness of division. And so at each step I grow, that is the conscious soul rises one step in awareness. My awareness itself becomes wider, deeper, more aware of a higher grade of awareness. And at the same time, my nature, my mind, thought substance, life energies, even my physical consciousness is taken up, widened and raised to a level commensurate with the awakening of the individual awareness. And in this way, a kind of a double scale of ascent takes place. Each time, with each level, there is a self-enlargement and transformation of all the rest. Now we saw last time, this is broadly the approach of nature in the slow evolution, in the slow yoga, which may take thousands or even a few million years. The same process could be accelerated and made to happen through many cycles taking place within a single lifetime. And that is also possible. That would be the nature of the yoga, which is conscious and accelerated. But there is the second approach, which is what he will focus on immediately. He writes, he may, that is the mental being which is arriving at this integral experience, he may on the other hand aim straight at the realization of pure self-existence on the highest plane of mental being. And from that secure basis, realize spiritually, under the conditions of his mentality, the process by which the self-existent becomes all existences. But without that descent into the self-divided egoistic consciousness, which is a circumstance of evolution in the ignorance. Now, if you took this sentence by itself, it would be somewhat overwhelming. But in the context, we can see what he's saying is something so profound, simple, and yet many-faceted. In the earlier movement of making each step up reintegrating, each step up, reintegrating. You're always living in a consciousness which is divided. And the nature of that division is the sense of I and not I. The separation of what you identify with and the rest which you do not identify with. Or, as we use the term, the ego sense, the sense of being cut off from the whole. And this ego, self-divided egoistic consciousness, he says, is a circumstance of evolution in the ignorance. Meaning it was not really necessary to have been there. It just happens to be there because of the way the evolution has developed in the ignorance. So let's understand this. The ego sense really essentially comes down to this. I protect that which I am, and against all that I am not. So you have a sense of a barrier of separation. That thing which is inside the barrier becomes for you extremely important. The rest which is not outside, which is not in the barrier, which is outside, is important only to the extent that it nourishes your little I. The barrier itself is what is formed by the circumstance of evolution in ignorance, because we started with a sense of something small. Let's say in our current life, from the point we were born, there is the body with which you feel yourself completely identified, and when something pokes or hits you, you feel pain, and that teaches your body, reminds you that this is the fragile you, and the things which come to hit it are not you, and you find yourself vulnerable against the rest. But this feeling itself, if you go back, originates not just in the body of you as the newborn baby, it originates in the body of the mother, from whom and in whom you developed your sense of separateness. And that habit of being separate, of being protective, is there in the mother even before the baby forms in her, and is there in her mother and in her parent, and all the way back, going back millions of years. How far? From the ape from which the human being has emerged? Or from the stages before the ape? How far does it go? And if you trace it back, you can find its roots going all the way to the single-celled creatures in the bacterium. In the single bacterium, you will find this sense of protectiveness and a reaction against anything which encroaches on its survival. Sri Aurobindo explains in the Life Divine that when life first emerges in matter, it is the first impulse that it organizes to survive, to protect itself against the rest. Because it emerges as a point, as a single tiny focus. And that's the origin of the ego sense. That becomes more complex as the life structure evolves. As the organism becomes more complex, the ego sense becomes more complex. So if you look at it this way, every single cell in your body has the ego sense. But there is a combined ego sense of the large organs. And there's a combined ego sense of the totality of your body. And even beyond the gross physical body, there is an ego sense extending into your psychological, subtle body. And all of this has over time gradually developed. Why? Because right at the beginning, the starting point was the sense of separateness that needed to protect itself against the rest. In an environment which was so hostile that the early efforts of emergence of life repeatedly were battered down. And Mother refers to this as a memory in our cells. When she went down into the cellular consciousness, she found essentially there was no reason for the cells to age and die. There was no practical reason. They could in principle continue indefinitely and be immortal, remain young forever, except that they had learned the habit the habit of tiring, of giving up and allowing themselves to age and die. And when she traced the origin of the habit itself, she found it right in the early stages of the emergence of life, when life was struggling to come out of matter and organize itself. Remember, there was this humongous universe of so-called dead matter, hostile to life. Everything is hostile to life. Our modern studies of life forms show us that, well, life is fragile. It can appear anywhere, even in some of the most hostile conditions, but it is fragile in its appearance. You go down to the depth of the ocean where there is volcanic lava emerging, where there is no sunlight, it is too cold, the pressure is too great for us, our body, and the bacteria here in the air to survive. It's too hot in the place near the lava, it's too cold in the ocean a few meters away, and somewhere in between there are tiny bacteria which have evolved. Finding just the right balance between the heat and the cold, feeding not on sunlight but on the heat that comes, certain heavy metals which are released in the lava emerging, and having developed under that huge pressure. It looks like in the most hostile circumstances the bacteria can emerge, life can form. But you take that bacteria out from there, bring it to the surface of the ocean, and they die. Because it is too cold, because the pressure is too low, because they have too much of sunlight, they do not have the nutrition they need there. So on the one hand, life is struggling to emerge everywhere in the universe. On the other hand, we see the fragility of its emergence. It is tied to the circumstances where it's emerging and fighting all the time. And so Mother observed that in the cellular consciousness, there was the memory of that earliest period in which again and again life was beaten back and forced to fail, and again it struggled to emerge, and again it was beaten back. That period might have lasted a few billion years. But the memory of that struggle remained as a habit in the cells, that after having been long enough around, oh, now it's time to be beaten back, to give up and collapse. Of course, before you do that, there is the second instinct that life has organized, to procreate, to replicate. And so the cell puts out from itself another cell, and then eventually breaks down and dies. And so we see that in our body to this day, the same habit continuing. Every cell ensures that it is replaced by other cells, even as it eventually accepts to give up and die. And of course, Mother's work was to say, well, this is not exactly the best habit, so can we change it? This habit does not belong to the divine consciousness, which is eternal. It does not even belong to the life energy. We don't need to go all the way to this oneness of the divine consciousness. Even life energy in the universe is immortal. In her own world, life energy free from matter is immortal. But when life energy enters matter and creates or organizes life forms from within matter, there is this passage of numbing, dulling, suffocating, in which it finds itself locked inside matter, and the struggle against the sheer resistance and inertia of the rigidity of matter. And that's where life builds up this habit of struggling, tiring, giving up and dying, meanwhile bursting a new copy of itself. Consider that in every human being, in every mother, a single cell can form entirely the new body of the child, which is part of her biology. Why cannot the same process happen inside her biology for her to regenerate her own body? In principle, there is no reason why it should not happen. After all, your body is formed of the cells that emerged out of your mother, and those cells formed from her mother, and effectively the continuity of the biological cells goes back many million years at least. You are tissue of her tissue, of her tissue, of her tissue. And if it could regenerate so many times, why not regenerate within the original parent form? In principle, yes. So we don't even need to go to a divine transformation in order to be able to awaken in the cellular consciousness the sense of immortality. It is native to life force itself. And with that is also the wide freedom of the life energy. It's not infinite. It does not have the oneness, but still it has a wideness. And that's the reason why every cell learns to engage with other cells and form communities. That's why every human being, even if you're brought up in complete isolation, having never met another human being, you will find as you grow, you will want to reach out and connect to others. Because underlying the unity of life is still there, although focused on this individual. And so when it comes to making the life form immortal, potentially, you could make it live as long as you want, potentially. Except that there would be certain limitations because life energy does not know the underlying oneness and the freedom of the self. And that's where the divinization becomes essential. If that form of youth has to be not just a rigid form of youth, but an actual evolving consciousness which grows beyond the limitations that form can offer. So Mother's effort was to take it to that level. The ego sense can easily widen out to a sense of a larger ego, but it cannot be free as long as you are dependent on life processes. For that you have to come to the deeper truth of the self. And so we look at some very fine, interesting insights here of the nature of life, even in matter. But the rigidity of matter is the big problem here. You could in principle hold the same life form. After a while, when the life form grows beyond a certain degree, the rigidity of matter may not be able to keep up. And a friction would ensue which would either suppress the life or break the life, break the form of matter in which life has evolved. That's where the spiritualization becomes essential. And this is the reason why in the actual transformation of the cells that the mother worked upon, it was not enough that you made the cells live as long as they like to stay young forever, but to bring into them the spiritual consciousness which would overcome the limitations of matter itself. Make matter responsive and plastic to the will of the self, even as the life force is responsive to the consciousness of the self, freed from the sense of ego. Now this is just the background to complete the discussion about cells and the circumstances of our evolution. We come back to the text, and what he is referring to here is that there has been this self-divided egoistic consciousness which is a circumstance of evolution in the ignorance. If not for that emergence out of ignorance, if not for the emergence through matter, through a fragmented piece of life, the sense of the egoistic consciousness need not have been there. And he's carefully using the word egoistic. Already in a life which is, let's say, free in the life plane, not in the physical plane, but in the vital worlds. The life will have a sense of ego perhaps, but much wider, more plastic, more free than the ego sense which is there inside a material form, which is much more protective in its instinct of its narrowness. But you could have had right from the beginning life emerging not in pieces but always aware of its totality, always wide, always free, and emerging and growing in that wide and free expression from the very beginning. In that case, this egoistic self-divided consciousness would not be necessary. It's because evolution has started from this tiny piece emerging out of matter that we have this as a circumstance of the evolution in ignorance. Now, why is this important? Because the approach he is going to take here, he says, not to continue in that same routine of being always tied down to the egoistic consciousness, but first breaking out of it by rising straight out. Aim straight at the realization of pure self-existence on the highest plane of mental being. And from that secure basis, realize spiritually, under the conditions of his mentality, the process by which the self-existent becomes all existences. And in that case, we bypass the problem of the ego completely. Right in the beginning, you have to somehow make that breakthrough of rising to that point where you are in that pure self-existence, in the highest plane available to you, in your waking mental consciousness. Once free of the ego, from there you re-embrace the multiplicity, no more bound by the ego. Contrast this with the other approach, which is always growing, always becoming more free, more wide, but always bound to that problem of a self-divided egoistic consciousness. Why? Simply because we started from below. If you look at these two approaches, it becomes obvious that while the first process would be quite thorough, could be speeded up, would be always rich and complete, it would involve far greater efforts, because each time, with each step, you would have to reintegrate and rebuild and recast yourself, always bound though within the limitation of your egoistic consciousness. The second process, although involving a first struggle to get to some highest poise, would begin from a consciousness that is liberated. And from the poise of liberation, embrace the limitations and multiplicity, remaining still free, never bound again in the egoistic consciousness, although living in narrow forms and working through narrow focal points of action. So a consciousness that would know itself as vast or vaster than the universe, free, could still focus and be in a body and act through the body. And of course this has a much greater attraction, and it's obviously more rapid if one could take that first step. So we reread the sentence. He may, on the other hand, aim straight at the realization of pure self-existence on the highest plane of mental being. And from that secure basis, realize spiritually, under the conditions of his mentality, the process by which the self-existent becomes all existences. But without the descent into the self-divided egoistic consciousness, which is a circumstance of evolution in the ignorance. And the whole thing is so brilliant in the insight he offers. But there are still a few secondary ideas, with comments he makes in passing with these words when he speaks of aim straight at the realization of pure self-existence on the highest plane of mental being. What is this realization of the pure self-existence on the highest plane of mental being? Recall the discussions in the earlier chapters, when there is a possibility to enter the highest consciousness of self-existence in Satchidananda. But if you enter that at first, you lose your mental consciousness. You are unable to engage with the world. You go into Supra mental state, and your mind-body goes into a trance. You snap back into the mental consciousness, you lose that poise. In order to be able to hold a poise of the Satchidananda consciousness while still being engaged in the world, one would have to be able to integrate these two domains, which is obviously not possible for the mentality as it is. And so he says, there is a poise even in the mental consciousness. There are finer gradations in the heights of the mind which correspond to the higher ranges of consciousness, including the Satchidananda. And in these higher ranges of the mind, you can have an experience of that as it represents itself in the higher range of mind. If that you can get to, you can have it in a full waking mental and physical consciousness, engaged with the world, but as much as the poise of this refined mind status can receive and hold of the Satchidananda. And it is to this that he is pointing now. It's not yet the complete supra-mental Satchidananda, but it is the highest poise that your mind can hold. And why is this important? Because it brings you to a level where not only you have bridged it, but from where you can bridge upward to that level which you could not otherwise ascend to without losing your awakened consciousness. So this is what he is referring to, the highest plane of mental being. And under conditions of mentality, from there you will know to embrace the multiplicity. It's not yet the full supramental embracement of the multiplicity. That will follow later. But if you have this, that becomes possible without losing the continuity. And that's going to be the theme of the subsequent chapters. So you see, even as a strategy of the spiritual journey, this is like a very rapid, a shortcut, if you may say, but it's a very rapid passage by which one is able then subsequently to complete that which is limited in this effort. One more phrase he has used, which is very important. From that secure basis, realize spiritually the process by which self-existent becomes all existences. Why does he use this phrase? From that secure basis. Because if you look at the other way, which is going through repeated poises of growth, reintegration, widening, reintegration, at no point are you in a consciousness that is fundamentally free from ego. You are never in a consciousness that knows some underlying truth or reality of the divine. Yes, you're growing. Yes, it is closer always. Yes, it is more complete, more beautiful, more perfect, but never touching something which is it and stable in it. If we take the second approach, you come to a consciousness which is stable in the mental awareness or realization of the Satchidananda. You can live in it permanently, never losing it. And from there, when you reintegrate, you never lose that poise. It is a similar observation he makes later on when he discusses the ascent of consciousness in the higher grades of the mind, and he speaks of the, not using those terms, but the illumined mind, the higher mind, illumined mind, intuitive mind, and overmind. And he says in the first two levels of the higher mind and illumined mind, you do not have stability. If you live in that consciousness, there will always be a tendency to either slide back or a need to rise above. But it's not a stable poise. But when you come to the intuitive consciousness, that is a stable poise. You can stay in it. It can become permanent and you don't need to make a special effort. It's a little bit like what we experience in our human development when we awaken to our rational, self-aware intellect. Now the power of intelligence is there in all human beings, less or more, even in animals, in the more developed animals. But there's a point where you're self-aware in your intelligence. You will see many people are not, or at least they don't live in it. We may even say a large mass of humanity does not live in it. They live in a mental awareness which is largely dominated by the emotions. They have emotional thoughts. That is, their thoughts are triggered by their emotions. The rationality is used to justify the emotions and argue out what the desire drives them to do. You made me angry is a common argument you will hear. Because they did this, therefore I became angry. Otherwise I would not have been angry. That's how you feel to yourself in the emotional mind. But if you step out of it and become self-aware, no. In that self-awareness where you're conscious that you're conscious, I didn't need to be angry. When I got angry, I got swayed by. I'm aware that I got swayed by this from something within me, from something outside me, doesn't matter. This self-aware mind is a poise of stability. When you live in it, You can actually look back at your own thought processes and say, this is too much of a mix. This is not clear thinking. You are aware of your own mind's limitations and the mix of your thoughts because this center is a stable center of freedom. From there, it can turn to change all the gradations below, or it can turn up and choose consciously even to open to higher inspiration. It can say, I decide that I will not initiate this action or these thoughts. I will wait for a higher inspiration. And it chooses to wait. When the higher inspiration comes, it can accept or refuse. So it's already a poise of freedom in the mind, where you will never again lose your rational center, self-aware, unless you accept to lose it. You could accept to lose it, but otherwise you can hold that and remain stable in it. But shift a little bit in the emotional mind, you've lost control. Emotions come strongly, you will be sucked. They come weakly, you will be half freed, but you'll never be stable. If you rise above from there into higher mind, it's a different poise of consciousness. No more relying on the rational self-awareness. And at that point again, you can tend to fall back or you can tend to rise, but there is no stable passage, stable point in the passage until you come to the intuitive mind. Now all of this Sri Aurobindo has mapped out. You will find it described in mantric experiential terms in Savitri as Ashwapati ascends level by level. He describes the poises of stability or the instabilities at various levels. But if you look at the whole ascent, it is in this highest position where you are utterly free of all sense of narrowness, limitation, ego therefore, that you have the most stable position as far as the ego consciousness is concerned. And so, he may on the other hand aim straight at the realization of pure self-existence on the highest plane of mental being, and from that secure basis realize spiritually, under the conditions of his mentality, the process by which the self-existent becomes all existences. And suddenly you realize, wow, this stability is the most secure. Anything below that, you would be in limitations of consciousness. You could easily slip into the egoistic consciousness. So from the perspective of the ego sense, and if we are aim to get free of the ego consciousness, this is the first poise you can get to where you are secure. You could choose from there to re-enter ego consciousness, but you could choose to engage with ego consciousness without losing your freedom. You have a choice. You are actually free there from ego. That's why it is secure basis. And what do you realize from the secure basis? This is the third important idea. The process by which the self-existent becomes all existences. When rising from below, what do you do when you turn to the sense of oneness? You accumulate pieces, larger pieces. Now I am as big as my family, I am as big as my community, I am as big as my nation, as big as the earth, as big as my solar system, as big as my galaxy, but there's still something outside which is not I. In your mind you can conceive of the whole universe, and still in your mind there is a not universe. It is only a larger ego. Less narrow, less rigid, less limited, but still it is ego. You're not free of the ego sense. You cannot know in the rising from below the true sense of the freedom from ego. You can only know gradations of freedom, but not the true freedom. On the other hand, when you come to this highest poise of pure self-existence and the secure base of egoless experience there, from there you can look at these poises and embrace them. How? The way the divine developed its free consciousness to become this multiplicity. When the divine chose to move from oneness to fragmenting into many infinite aspects of himself, at no point is there ego consciousness. Always there's an aspect, another, and infinitely diverse aspects. Within each, again in infinitely diverse aspects. Within each infinity, each aspect of its infinity taking on another infinity of aspects. And that's how he becomes the multiplicity, infinitely. An infinity of infinitesimals. That's the universe. And he becomes like that. But at no point in his consciousness is he ever bound into limitation. This piece and that is not I. He never experiences that. Everything is himself. So the divine, when he moves from oneness to multiplicity, he moves free always. Never bound by ego, although playing with all the tiniest fragments of infinitesimals, freely. And now look at this. If we go from below upwards and try to get to an egoless consciousness, okay, you get to something better, but never the thing itself. But if you go straight up into the full freedom and the secure basis, from there you can re-embrace all these multiplicities the way the divine embraces them. And when you re-embrace them, you are still free in the secure basis, egoless. Including when you re-embrace your own body and mind and individuality, you're still free from the ego sense. Because you experience everything else as yourself, as your own other forms and bodies of your underlying oneness, which is the secure foundation. And this is the way the yoga is going to develop, which will be what he describes over the coming chapters. So now we reread the sentence and you get the full impact of all these different perspectives and insights. He may, on the other hand, aim straight at the realization of pure self-existence on the highest plane of mental being, and from that secure basis realize spiritually, under the conditions of his mentality, the process by which the self-existent becomes all existences. But without that descent into the self-divided egoistic consciousness, which is a circumstance of evolution in the ignorance. And you see what he has captured, and it's so beautiful, so simple, and so natural even for us. Something within our heart says, yes, this is obvious. One fine point remains as a tertiary idea, third level in the hierarchy of idea, where he says, realize spiritually under the conditions of his mentality. So realize in the consciousness that knows oneness, but still within the frame of the mental awareness, which can know a waking state in the body, in life. So that phrasing is suggestive of this truth. Then what happens next? Once you have that, you still have not got the highest station, which is supramental, beyond the mind. You still need to get into trance to get to that. He explains, thus identified with Satchidananda in the universal self-existence, as the spiritualized mental being, he may then ascend beyond to the supramental plane of the pure spiritual existence. So because you have already got this poise of the experience of the Satchidananda as universal self-existence, in the mental consciousness which can be awake, although spiritualized mind, from there you can continue to build the ascent to the pure supramental plane of the experience without losing the link. That's the phase of the yoga which Sri Aurobindo describes as the supramental yoga. Up to there, what is to be realized is not yet supramental. It is still the yoga as it takes place in the higher ranges of the mental consciousness. It may be assisted by supramental consciousness. It may offer you glimpses of the supramental consciousness as you ascend, but it is not yet the actual supramental ascent until this phase begins. And in one of the letters, Sri Aurobindo writes, because in those days, in the 30s and 40s, reading all these very inspiring things and being in physical proximity and experiencing sometimes the overwhelming impact of the mothers and Sri Aurobindo's presence, some sadhaks began to talk of supramental. And so Sri Aurobindo writes in a very firm letter, he says that it is premature to speak of the supramental consciousness or of realizing it unless you have already realized the universalization of your consciousness, unless all the chakras within you have already been opened and there has been a full awakening of the inmost psychic being and its emergence, and all this foundation is ready, then you can speak of the supramental ascent. Otherwise it is dangerous to speak of it. Of course, the situation has changed subsequent to 1956, when the supramental consciousness has been brought down as an active principle in evolution. The result is, although we may not have a direct experience of it, its action in us is present through 2 degrees of limitation, through degrees of its own self-limitation. As an infinite consciousness, if it touches you as a finite piece, boom, like a wave, it will shatter the narrow little ego. So it limits itself to a finite form and then reflects into your mind and thus begins gently to nudge and assist. So is it supramental? Not in the way it touches us, but in its origin it is the supramental. So from a certain perspective you can say, yes, the supramental consciousness is everywhere. Our perception of it may be limited or non-existent, but nevertheless in our aspiration we can open to it. And in our aspiration we can invoke that highest action. And it will work through its own degrees of limitation. In our journey as we ascend and grow, we may glimpse it and open ourselves to its action, and it can assist us in this evolution. But it is only when we come to that poise that Sri Aurobindo has referred to in those letters that we can engage with it directly and begin the actual process of the supramentalization of the mind, life and body. Directly, in a direct action. But this is only to understand the full framework of the further development. The point being, because you have got to this spiritualized mental poise and experiencing the Satchidananda there, from there one can make the bridge without losing the continuity, without needing to go into trance in order to know the divine as the divine knows himself. And for the rest then begins the whole process of the transformation of life. So Sri Aurobindo concludes this paragraph with, it is the latter method, the stages of which we may now attempt to trace for the seeker by the path of knowledge. Remember, in this portion that we are reading, it is still primarily the path of knowledge. In each of the 3 paths, the integral yoga of works, the integral yoga of knowledge, the integral yoga of love, Sri Aurobindo takes the whole movement as far as it can until it borders the higher supramental possibilities, forming with these 3 a kind of a triple base in which our whole nature is engaged and turned to the divine. As these grow, become more complete, the integral yoga proper, the yoga of self-perfection, begins to build around and through these efforts, taking up all of ourselves simultaneously. So it is the latter method, the stages of which we may now attempt to trace. Sri Aurobindo, Mother said, Sri Aurobindo was the most humble man she had ever met. And the sense of the humility we can appreciate from one who has had all these most extraordinary, most complete experiences, and he's saying with the authority of that foundation, and he says, we may now attempt to trace. Very gentle, very humble in his approach in everything. Even in his letters, when some of the disciples used to try to challenge him to make a formal declaration of his identity and his work and his achievement, very quietly, gently, he would bypass and avoid getting into any such dramatic declarations. So this is the path now ahead which he will be describing. Briefly then we recapitulate what we have been brought to so far over the last few chapters, and he puts this in the form of one sentence. When the sadhaka has followed the discipline of withdrawal from the various identifications of the self with the ego, the mind, the life, the body, he has arrived at realization by knowledge of a pure, still, self-aware existence. One, undivided, peaceful, inactive, undisturbed by the action of the world. So in one sentence, it's summarizing several chapters in which he described a very practical process by which the mind steps back from the false identification with the ego. Briefly, to recapitulate certain important ideas, the point he made in those discussions was that our error in ignorance is the false identification with our body, with our life energies, with our mind, which makes us feel that we are this. It's true that we live in them, it's true that we work through them, it's true that they exist as so many different parts, limited, and so many sheaths, however limited. But for us to identify and say, this is me, is the error. So this identification, of course, most obviously felt in our early childhood, when the body is our identity. When something hits you, I am hurt, you hit me. That's the natural response you have. Some of this habit may stay into adulthood, but if we have worked a little bit on ourselves, if there has been some maturity brought upon by life or by conscious effort, you get a blow and you say, my hand is hurt, I hurt my leg. You don't say, I am injured. You don't say, I am broken. You do not say, I am bleeding. Of course, it's not a question of words, it's the sense of identification. My hand is bleeding. My finger is broken. My stomach is aching. And there's already in your consciousness some kind of separation from the body and its processes. Who are you then? And often in the first level of separation, you may say, when somebody uses a word of abuse or criticizes you, you say, you are hurting me when you say that. Your words hurt me. And it's often at a level when you identify with your emotions. To feel not accepted by others hurts. What? My identification with the emotions. You could step back from that and in a very rational way look at your emotions and say, no, that's just another layer of habitual identification, that's not me. And at the level of pure thought, when you're identified there are very few things which could hurt you. But even there, you may experience the sense of being overwhelmed, the sense of having too much to do. So Sri Aurobindo describes 3 steps. First, consciously stepping back from the body, saying, I am not body, and affirming this poise of freedom. Second, stepping back from the emotions and life energies and life habits, life instincts. I am not the emotions or these instincts. And there's a third step where now you're aware of your thoughts. You step back from the thoughts themselves. You're still a mind awareness, but you say, I am not thoughts. I am not this habitual activity. And at that point you come to a poise where you're conscious as an awareness, having thoughts, having emotions, having body and sensations. But the awareness itself is none of these. This poise is not difficult to attain. It may take a few minutes of effort, perhaps, of concentration, in which you can come to this self-aware mental center. And it's a good step. It's the first good foundation on which the real spiritual journey can begin. But it has nothing to do with spirituality yet. It's only a first poise of freedom in the mind. At that point, this mental awareness can turn upon itself. And in the path of knowledge, it would say, well, what is this awareness? Who is aware of what? And remember, you've discarded thoughts. You're no more aware of thoughts. You're no more aware of emotions, things outside you. You're aware of your own awareness. And you dwell on this. And at that point, gradually, there is the sense of this, which he describes. A kind of a pure, still, self-aware consciousness. You're aware, and you're aware that you're aware. This awareness is nowhere in particular. It simply is. And you can remain immersed in this. Pure, still, self-aware existence. And you go deeper into it, there's a sense of a freedom. There's a sense of boundaries fading away. And you experience that this cannot be divided. It's simply one awareness. So one, undivided, peaceful, inactive. There's nothing it does. If from this poise you become aware of thoughts, emotions and sensations, well, they are happening. I'm not doing them. Thoughts come, they go. Thoughts pass, they rise, they fall. I am not thinking out. And so there is a poise where all this stuff is happening, which is not I. What I am is doing nothing. Peaceful, inactive, undisturbed by the action of the world. When you are founded in that, then anything that happens, at best it's like a cinema. It's happening, it's passing. If you identify, you get sucked into it. If you choose to remain free, it can happen, it cannot happen, doesn't matter. You are unaffected. Now this initially may involve degrees of identification when you first begin to practice this. There will be times when you are more free. There will be times when you tend to get sucked. When it concerns people close to you, the heartstrings are still strong. You're not really free of them. When it comes to your favorite ideas or habitual thought patterns, something challenges it. No, it cannot be. I've always believed that this is how it should be and not that way. You get sucked into some reaction. And that's always a sign that you've not really got completely free. So there is a passage very similar to what happens when you're watching a movie. You will notice as children, it's quite obvious, they get identified. Eyes are open, they've stopped blinking, mouth gets open sometimes, their body is limp and they're just watching. The whole consciousness is sucked into the experience. And at that point you can come from behind, you can call them, they don't hear you. They've forgotten themselves in total identification. But something happens, and you watch children, there's a romantic scene, and you'll see the little children get embarrassed and they start looking at each other, break out of the identification. It's a weird sensation. Adults, on the other hand, may get more sucked into that experience because it's something that is familiar to them and perhaps they're attracted to that experience. But you notice the power, and we'll use the word hypnotic power, to suck you into the experience, and yet your ability or your innate instinct to be able to separate from the experience when it becomes uncomfortable. If you observe this when it happens while watching a movie, you will realize it is exactly the same thing happening in us now. It is the same hypnotic identification by which we have got sucked into thought patterns, which come into us from outside, which arise from somewhere inside, and we are identified with the thought, the emotions, and then with the body sensations. But at any point when there's a strong shock, something backs off, something disconnects and steps back. Often this happens when someone very close to us suddenly dies, and it's a shock. Oh, such a young person, it could happen to anyone, it could happen to me overnight. And something hits you and it throws you back, a kind of a numbness we feel. Suddenly all the things of life which you cherish so much feel uninteresting, distant. And when that happens, it's a first glimpse of this kind of poise of separation from the emotions particularly and the emotional nature. It's an automatic mechanism within us by which we protect ourselves from being overwhelmed with emotions. So often when people have had a death in the family, somebody close, there's an initial period where there's this kind of numbness. You find yourself able to function, do whatever is required, and a few months down, suddenly the emotions rush back and you feel overwhelmed with a sense of loss and with a sense of missing and so on. This separative mechanism is an instinct, perhaps a protection also from the inner being, which helps you to navigate more disturbing challenges of life. There is a term used, shell shock. Suddenly there's a shock. They use it in the military when there's a shell that explodes nearby. For a moment you are stunned. You hear nothing, you feel nothing, you're able to function in no way, and you're in a shock. And at that point suddenly you find nothing affects you. Even the sounds and things, the whole world feels as if happening far away, and you are in a deep silence. And then gradually the whole thing returns and suddenly you engage yourself. Now the interesting thing is, instinctively when this happens at first, you are uncomfortable. What is this? Am I going crazy? I am not normal. And you want to re-engage quickly, get back to your normal habit. If you knew what this meant, you would say, this is an interesting poise, let me experience this, let me deepen it even. And you can make an effort to develop that poise of detachment. And once established deeply, you can re-engage with life without getting sucked into the hypnosis of all the things which are happening with which you were identified. So in the descriptions we have been through before, Sri Aurobindo discusses how it is easy to disengage from the body identification, even from the emotional identification. The part where you disengage from your thoughts is more difficult. And after that, in this point of awareness, which is I observing my own thoughts, that's the tricky part. From there, how do you get to something which is not this narrow center? And the way normally used is to dwell on the sense of awareness. Where does this awareness come from? What is the source of it? And the awareness turns upon itself to deepen. Now the same thing could be given a turn of bhakti, of the heart's participation. As you separate from all this, what do you turn to? You turn with your heart's devotion, love and self-giving to the divine, with the idea that your awareness is only a part of the divine. Your emotions and the love that you feel is turning and becoming like a flame, leading you upwards to closeness and immersion in the divine consciousness. The same thing could be given a third form in the yoga of works, where while you are in this poise of consciousness, what happens to these thoughts, emotions and sensations and activities of your life? You say, well, all of these are happening mechanically anyway, they are not me, but since they have to continue, you let them continue and bring into them this idea that in these actions, through these emotions, through these thoughts, everything is coming from the infinity of the divine consciousness, flowing back into the divine consciousness. If you have the sense of doership, then you say, I do this as an offering, as a consecration to the one that is all. Your awareness dwelling on that, deepening in closeness to the sense of immersion in the oneness. So, one of these three, combination of these three, but you can see how it's possible to turn your consciousness towards that. In the pure approach of the yoga of knowledge, one would simply turn to the sense of awareness and the source of self-awareness. And it's the question which Ramana Maharshi asks when he says, who is asking the question? If somebody would ask him some question of philosophy, sure, he could perhaps answer it, but it doesn't matter. What matters is get to yourself. When you realize yourself, the question will be obvious, the answer will be obvious. And so he says, who is asking the question? Find that. And when one turns in this way, one begins a process of deepening. And there are many degrees, layers as one goes deeper. There may come a time when you take on this practice with concentration, there may come a time when your eyes will spontaneously close as you get into some kind of immersion into awareness. That's when this becomes more and more obvious. He has arrived at knowledge, he has arrived at realization by knowledge of a pure, still, self-aware existence, one, undivided, peaceful, inactive, undisturbed by the action of the world. And at that point, two things could happen. At that point, you open your eyes, you remain like that. Or you may partially engage where a part of you remains like that, free. And if you can develop this, you will find a great freedom which naturally brings with it a sense of a detached contentment, a kind of a detached joy, for lack of a better word, but it's not an emotional joy, it's simply content to be. And there's nothing more deeply satisfying than that. Against all the emotions that the world could give you, yes, they're fun, they're interesting, but none of them will give you the deep satisfaction that this poise of contentment can give. This, of course, is your approach to the self, and the silence of the self, or the poise of the witness of the self, and you're approaching to whatever degree. The only relation that this self seems to have with the world is that of a disinterested witness, not at all involved in, or affected, or even touched by any of its activities. They happen, they don't happen, that's fine. Now here's the point where one could stop. It's a stable poise, you could stop. You could also go deeper. And so this is what he refers to. And the phrasing he uses is very suggestive. If this state of consciousness is pushed farther, one becomes aware of a self even more remote from world existence. All that is in the world is, in a sense, in that self, and yet at the same time extraneous to its consciousness, non-existent in its existence, existing only in a sort of unreal mind, a dream, therefore, an illusion. So what he has described here so far are two poises, two degrees of this experience. In the first experience, there was this very undivided, self-aware, one existence, peaceful, and its relationship is witness, disinterested, unaffected, and you could live life completely normal. What will happen if you were to remain in that poise and continue your activities? You would not experience any sense of initiation. It's happening. There are thoughts which come, there are emotions which rise, there are sensations coming. You see your body doing things, you see your mind working, replying, doing things. Normal. To people, they may not notice anything, except they may feel something distant, something detached, not quite clear what. If they're observant enough, they may feel it, otherwise they may say, oh, it's the same person, but he looks a little distant, a little less emotionally engaged. But that's about all. But there's something else one could do, take it to a deeper degree. And in that deeper degree, the witness felt itself separate from the world, but in this deeper degree, the world is not really separate, it is a part of your totality. It is somewhere inside, yet at the same time outside. Non-existent in its existence. It's happening in your overall consciousness, but it's not a part of you really. It is almost like there's this layer of the mind, very fine awareness of mind, in which the whole world exists. To the extent that the mind turns to observe the world and register it, the world exists. If the mind chooses not to turn, the world really doesn't exist even. It is this poise that is greatly valued in the Buddhist tradition, where they will speak of everything is a creation of the mind. Of course, the poise can be brought to a more superficial level in our understanding when they will say, and in a form of argument, when you say there are flowers here, where are the flowers? You say it's on the table. Where is the table? Oh, it's in the room. Where is the room? You can keep asking. And finally you come to this conclusion, actually, it's all in your mind. As long as you are aware of the room exists. As long as you are aware of the flowers, they exist. As long as you are aware of the flowers on the table, well, the flowers are on the table. If in your mind you were to obliterate this, they don't exist. And so the argument goes to the point where everything is in your mind. You do not actually know if the flower is out there. All you know is in your mind it is appearing as a perception or an experience. You knock out the mind and what happens? Everything ceases to be. At least that's the way the theory goes. And you can see, you can understand this on a very physical level. The scientist will agree with this logic and say, after all, your experience of the flower is what you experience in your brain. The way the brain interprets the light waves which strike the retina, isn't it? If I could tamper with your brain and reprogram your brain, you would look at the yellow flowers and experience them as blue. In fact, we can do these experiments, not just by triggering brain centers with electrodes, but even by hypnosis. You can get into somebody's mind and hypnotize the person to say, all the yellow colors will now appear to you blue. And the person will walk around and actually see all yellow as blue. Or you can tell the person that as of this point, I am invisible to you. And then you go and stand in front of the person and the person will not see you. You tap him on the head and the person will wonder, where is this tapping coming from? He actually does not see you. And so many other fascinating experiments, simply to demonstrate that finally it's in your mind that you're experiencing the whole world. There's nothing else of the world really that you can be sure of. It could all be that you're living in the matrix and it's a computer plugged into your brain which is creating this illusion of the experience of the world. You cannot know. All you know is your mind is aware of this experience taking place in itself. Now this is how the scientist can also accept on a very superficial physical level. But the truth of this actually resides all the way back in this status of consciousness. There is a status deeper within that you can get to, where all this is actually taking place in you. You're not witness of something else. It is taking place in you, and yet it is extraneous to you because nothing in you is really participating in it. So he describes this in a very beautiful way. All that is, first of all, he says, one becomes aware of a self even more remote from the world existence. All that is in the world is, in a sense, in that self, and yet at the same time extraneous to its consciousness, non-existent in its existence, existing only in a sort of unreal mind, a dream, therefore, an illusion. So if you see the sequence as he describes it, there are degrees, deepening, 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 until at the last stage, yes, the world is there, but almost like a dream. And even finally you can say it's an illusion because it has no basis by which to exist. The same conclusion you could come to with a very physical mind, recognizing, oh, all this is taking place in my mind and there is nothing I can be truly sure of. So when you observe students of Buddhism who take this approach, they generally capture it on this level. But when the master speaks of it from a deep experience, he's speaking from that level. This reminds us of a deep truth discussed earlier. Every higher state of consciousness reflects and organizes itself on many secondary levels, on which you can glimpse that truth as represented on that level. And this is something of that which you see here. In the physical mind, in the mind as it is embedded in the body consciousness, you can have a glimpse of this truth. But if you have a glimpse of this truth here, from here to that is an easy passage. You could similarly step back in your mind's awareness, not just the physical mind, and in the mind experience the conviction of this. And from there step back to this poise. But the method he's describing here is from that first status of witness. What do? If this state of consciousness is pushed farther, one becomes aware of a self even more remote. If it is pushed farther, and here is the very interesting thing, the suggestion. Any poise, any experience you have, you can remain in it for a while, but you can choose within the experience to deepen it, to push it deeper, farther, to its completion, to its essence. And this is always a choice. Really, the problem we face in our life is experiences come upon us. We enjoy them while they last. We don't make the effort to contain, to hold, or to deepen the experience. As a result, they pass. And afterwards we say, oh, it's gone. We do not make the effort to deepen, which would be the other way, not just to contain and hold, but actually to allow it to grow. And the method, Mother says, is become very quiet. Especially when there is a deeper spiritual experience, any activity or agitation within you tends to break the foundation on which the experience rests. And then it as if kind of evaporates, fades out, becomes thinner, fading away. But if you remain very quiet, remain very still, the experience settles and then deepens and settles deeper into you. And at that point you can almost as if absorb it and hold it. And if you can maintain that poise, you can then choose even to deepen the experience. Simply as he describes here, if it is pushed farther, and then a deeper depth emerges. And now he begins to describe this. What happens when you thus go deeper into this? This aloof and transcendent real existence, real R cap, existence E cap, we'll see why. This aloof and transcendent real existence may be realized as an utter self of one's own being. This is one option. Or the very idea of a self of one's own being may be swallowed up in it. So that it is only for the mind an unknowable that. Unknowable to the mental consciousness and without any possible kind of actual connection or commerce with world existence. So again, it's two different poises in the experience itself. On one side, you experience it as yourself, your own true, deepest, real self. Or even it's the sense of I is swallowed up and there is only something indescribable and everything is just that. And this is the approach in the Vedantic tradition when they speak of tat, that, no he, no personality, sheer impersonal vast oneness. Again in the Buddhist tradition, because the focus is not on not self, it is to this approach that they go. But you could poise also on the sense of self, one that is all and conscious that it is all. The difference is only whether the emphasis is in consciousness or in the existence. Slight shift in the focus of your intention can make a huge shift in the description of the experience itself, although it is always the same one. It can even be realized by the mental being as a nihil, non-existence or void. but a void of all that is in the world, a non-existence of all that is in the world, and yet the only reality, capital R. So there's a third approach one could experience it, where you say it is an emptiness, which is the vocabulary often seen in Buddhism. But if you ask them, well, what is emptiness? The mind first says, not all this. It can only know that by a negation. So actually, Sri Aurobindo points out, it's a void of all that is in the world. A non-existence of all that is in the world. So it's just one of the approaches. So say, not this, not this, not this, to get to some essential. But there's the other approach which could say, this also, and this, and this, and this, accepting, embracing and transcending each thing, and you would get to the same thing, by a positive way or by a negative way. But at the end you come to something which is none of these things. It as if includes them all and yet is free of them all. And yet the only reality, what exists, what lasts, just that. So here we come to these two words he has used earlier. This aloof, transcendent, real, R cap, existence, E cap. What is meant by this capitalization? So the word real and reality, what do we mean when we speak of this? What is real? When you have a mirage, you're walking in the desert and you see the shimmering. You think it's water. You go there, it's not water. So you say it was unreal. You're walking on the road here, you see the shimmering, you know it's not water. And yet it looks like water. Something that appears to be but is not is what we say unreal. So there are people not having seen a ghost, they will say ghosts are unreal. Your imagination, your fantasy, creation of your mind. Actually the problem is anything your mind creates is actually real in the mental world. There's nothing which is unreal. But we set that aside. For our practical experience we say unreal when what it appears is not what it is. Actually there was nothing, you imagined something to be there and that's all. But now apply this principle to everything in the world. Remember, the world is the way your mind sees it. Under hypnosis, you may be told that this is a yellow flower when in fact it is green. You wouldn't know, because that's how your mind sees it. What is the reality behind? You cannot know. This is the interesting thing. You cannot know what is the reality because you can only know what your mind registers. By its habit, by its programming, by the universal nature, mind, whatever term you give to the source of it. What is real? Everything your mind sees is dependent on how mind sees, is dependent on other things. And so if you go deep into this question, you will say, that is real which depends only on itself and on nothing else. As long as something depends on something else, if that else changes, this changes. So as children we were given this puzzle. The teacher draws a line on the blackboard with the chalk and says, without touching this line, can you make it smaller? Of course we want to erase, but you say without touching it. How do you make it smaller? Well, one thing which, of course, the solution that they do, you draw a larger line next to it. In relation to the larger line, this is now smaller. You make it bigger, you draw a shorter line next to it. Now it has become bigger, right? Bigger, smaller are all relative terms. Bigger than what? Smaller than what? It depends on something else. Or the other solution would be, you step out and go far and look at the same line from a distance. Now it looks smaller. Depending on your point of view. Often when you see children, the first time they go high up on a mountain and they look down, they see the cars and buses and the little people walking around. Oh, it looks like matchboxes and ants crawling around matchboxes. Right? Your perspective has changed. Suddenly everything is so small, so trivial. As the plane is taking off, You look down and you see these thousands of houses, hundreds of cars, and in each of them there are people obsessed with their immediate moment and their problems, and you look at the whole thing and say, my God, there's this huge reality, they're unaware of it, all lost in their own little daydreams. Why? Because your perspective changed, it now sees things larger. The people, the first astronauts who went into space and looked back at the earth, they came back changed fundamentally. They said, we saw the world without borders. We saw it physically. And so the physical mind is convinced all these are artificial divisions. We are one family, one earth. Not only that, they've seen these billions of stars with billions of planets. We're just one of all these. The sense of the immensity of life, the triviality of our small problems. You're fighting each other, killing each other because your great-grandfather insulted my great-grandfather. What's the point of it all? So silly, so petty. Everything, the details blur down, and you have this sense of great freedom. But all of these are shift in perspective. So what is real? Everything that you know in the world changes according to your perspective, changes according to everything else around it. If you change the color of the light shining here, the same red will appear orange. That which is blue will become violet. That which is white will become greenish or bluish or reddish, depending on the what we call color balance. So when a video camera is recording, it does not know what is the color balance to adjust to. You have to manually set it. Tell the video camera, look, this is the real white. So when the camera is set up, you point it to a white, and depending on the lighting in the room, you say this is white, it tunes itself now, and all the other colors become correct. There's nothing here which is absolute in itself. In the whole universe, everything is not real, everything is relative, everything is shifting, dependent on everything else, except the experience of that. The consciousness which is one, independent of all. It is oneness indivisible. It exists in itself, not by something else. The plant can grow because of the soil and sunlight. Even its existence is dependent. That exists independent of everything else. What it is, to its own awareness, is complete, unchanging, independent of everything else. No experience of things in the world will change that. Rather, experience of that will change your perspective of everything in the world. That alone is real, capital R. So there's a small r, real, as a transitional temporary reality, against that which is unreal, which is fantasy of your imagination or misreading of your perspective. And then there's the capital R, which is the self-existent. And so with it comes the capital E, existent. Because its existence is not dependent on anything else. It simply is. All things here in the physical world are dependent. If nothing else, on immediate circumstances, they're dependent on certain temperatures. If in this room the temperature rose high enough, spontaneously the wood would catch fire. That's what happens when you have a bit of lava that comes during a mountain eruption. Lava comes to homes and you see bursting out, the trees burst into flames, houses catch fire just like that because temperature has gone up. It was dependent on temperature remaining in a very narrow band. If it goes too cold, it begins to crack and break. Our human life is dependent on a narrow band, temperatures, oxygen levels, etc. But even what we consider solid, the rock, is dependent on all these things. You take it out into different circumstances, it changes its character. If on the solid granite you infuse upon it physical vibrations of a very high order, going to millions of vibrations per second, the whole granite breaks down and becomes fine powder. Now these are experiments done in laboratory. What is the reality of this? What is its innate existence? Nothing. And yet in your mind you say the granite is still there in my mind. What I saw and the reality of granite as an idea is still permanent, isn't it? The reality of flower, you may break this flower, but the reality of flowerness of the flower is permanent. So although physical objects can be broken, the idea of the object, which is behind their physical appearance, that is permanent, you will say. And that's why Sri Aurobindo uses this term, real idea. So the mind's idea, we can say yes, it has greater permanence, but it's not yet really permanent. In your mind, one could erase that idea, one could modify it, one could place it in relation to another bigger idea, and this would change. But if you go deep enough behind that idea, there is a original creative idea of the self. When it conceives of the universe, when it conceives of the flower experience, when it conceives of the human experience and the prototype of the human consciousness and the flower consciousness and the tree and so on. At that level, when it conceives, it is the one real self-existent. And when it conceives, all that it conceives is self-existent, real, although formed as idea. In that domain, what Sri Aurobindo calls supramental, this idea is real because it is self-existent. And because it exists, everything in the universe will begin to follow like a magnet influencing all the iron particles. Because it exists, everything begins to form around it, enclothed it as if on different levels, until eventually in the physical world you have the appearance of flower. And as the flower is born and it fades and dies, the real idea behind remains permanently, supporting all appearance of flower. And as a human creative being, if you could rise to that consciousness and bring out a new real idea, the same way as we do with the mental mind, you create a new idea. Let me design a new building, a new vehicle, a new fashion clothing, a new software. You conceive of something and then you translate it into material terms. So in the original creative consciousness of the real, the self, you could turn and bring into appearance any new form as real idea. And even if you did nothing else, the form itself being power of self, knowledge of self, nothing can resist it. It will compel its own emergence and expression in life. That's why the yogi, conceiving of something and turning it, releasing it, can have an enormous impact on the whole universe, although physically he may seem to do nothing. That idea will go out, catch the people who are open to it, work through them, and end up being materialized. That's the power of the real idea, because it is real and self-existent, not dependent on anything else. When it meets opposition, it is able to overcome, because anything opposing to it is a part of its own reality, and it knows how to use it to further itself. So when we are speaking of real, we understand it differently. Capital R, existence, that which is by itself. Now with the mind, you can conceive of it and then somewhere the mind fails. I can't visualize it, that's fine. But somewhere deep inside you, the idea of it, the concept of it, you can feel, yes, it's true. It must be, there can be no other way. All this is supporting the universe. You feel the truth of it intuitively, and we hold that. And this is the only language which can express it. This aloof and transcendent real existence may be realized, and it describes in these three different ways. And from there, what more can you do? If you go further, to proceed farther towards that transcendence, by concentration of one's own being upon it, is to lose mental existence and world existence altogether, and cast oneself into the unknowable. And that's the transition that you can make. You cease to be aware of yourself or of the world, and you remain immersed in it. You may emerge from it, and the only description you will have of what you were in is unknowable, because you're now in the mental consciousness which cannot know it. So this is as far as one could go in this kind of effort. what purpose will it serve? What's the goal for us? And he says in the next paragraph, the integral yoga of knowledge demands instead a divine return upon world existence. And its first step must be to realize the self as the all. Sarvam Brahma. Sarvam, all this, Brahma, one, that is all. So, first step is realize the self as the all. So from that poise, you turn to look at the world instead of seeing it only as this dream-like, illusory, superficial reality. You say all this which is being seen dream-like as reality, superficial reality, is in this, an expression of this. And bit by bit, layer by layer, it's as if you recover the perception of everything else as part of this, as a reality of this. And so he describes the steps here. First, concentrating on the self-existent, we have to realize all of which the mind and senses are aware as a figure of things existing in this pure self that we now are to our own consciousness. And then this, bit by bit, proceeds. And he describes over a series of sentences how eventually we realize that all things are itself taking on so many forms. All things exist in that self, and the self is in all things, and all forms are itself. Layer by layer, you recover and re-embrace the universe. But remember, having got to this poise, when you re-embrace, you never lose this. Once you've woken up, you never fall back into the illusion. And that's the beauty of the experience. The illusion is the way we saw things to be. We saw them as pieces, we saw them as relatives, we saw them as unstable appearances. When you wake up and review and re-embrace, you see them all as expressions of the real, expressions of that existence. And you see them differently. They're still there, but you're seeing them in a different consciousness, freed from the illusion of your perception. So all that will be what we will discuss in the on next Friday. But for now, we just look back at what he has described here. This is this attempt to first get to this poise of freedom, from which now we will turn back. And on turning back, as we embrace, we will know how this oneness organizes itself on each level, including forming these appearances of division. Just as in the separation we took this poise of I am not this, not this, not this, we will re-engage with each of those, not only in the I, but now also in the all. So if I am this, what is the rest? Is also that. That becomes I, that becomes all the way down. Soul, nature, all the way down. Or both expressions of the same one. And the result is, in this re-embracement, the ego sense ceases to be. You may still have a focal point of I, you may still have the sense of the all, but the sense of separation is no more. It is the one real existence taking these forms. So that whole process we will explore later. You can see when he describes these things, and as we dwell on them in our mind, some part of our mind experiences as if by reflection the truth of it. And we can remain in that, we can remain in that poise, even make the effort to extend this perception into everything. If you pursue this effort, let's say over the coming week, you'll find many times it will begin to happen even spontaneously. You are walking by, you look at things, and suddenly there's this sense as if everything is like an appearance, like a stage, like a drama. Or you could focus on that and say, oh, this looks like fake or unreal. Or you could focus on the thing which is emerging, the sense of an underlying vast silence or reality, against which this looks like fake. So by the old habit, you will stay in the narrow consciousness and say, oh, it feels weird, everything looks unreal. But if you recognize, no, that's not the point. The point is this which is real. And you turn to that, and that grows and that deepens. And it can happen very spontaneously, naturally, and growing layer by layer. And this is well within our reach. So we can pause here and take up any comments or questions.
I guess it's a question. It's about, all of this, a lot of what you've spoken about is in one form or another what I have understood to be the witness consciousness. And that's always been something in Sri Aurobindo's writing that I could never really get a grip on properly what he meant by this. It seems, the way I've understood it, I just want to know if you think I've got it wrong or right, is the idea that you can be a witness to your existence, your on different levels of your being. So you can be a witness from your higher mind, your illumined mind, and your intuitive mind. But it's only once you get to your intuitive mind, where you said you have that point of stability, that you can be truly secure in the point of being.
Well, it's one of the secure poises. It's not the most secure for the ego, for which you have to go all the way to this poise. Yes.
Okay, that's... And I guess my other I wanted to recount to you an experience of a friend of mine. And I just want to know what you think his experience was that he underwent. This is from over 15 years ago when I was in the army, and a good friend of mine was a champion ultra runner. So he used to run vast distances.
Champion what?
Ultra runner, anything over 26 miles. So he entered this race in America, which is a 100-mile race through the Rocky Mountains. Only crazy people do things like this, and he was one of the British Army's elite. And he goes, there came a point when he was running where he felt all of his body breaking down. And he was running and running and running. And then he goes, all the pain stopped, and he felt as if for the last 10 miles of the race, he was just looking at himself as he was running. He's not a spiritual man. He'd be the first to say so.
Yes.
What do you think happened to him? Was that in his consciousness?
It is the first experience of a wider consciousness, not necessarily higher. So let me just give a general background. This kind of experience often happens in endurance sports. And as we struggle, as we push the limits of our body, the biology no more functions. It as it breaks down its limits and begins to draw upon deeper and higher resources. And one of the first things which happens is it begins to draw energy from above, the life force from above. No more by a biological, physical process of conversion of sugars, as they describe it, but directly absorbing a universal energy. That's often the point where we experience while running what is called a second breath. You'll notice this happens where suddenly there's a burst of energy, and after that you're no more panting with the same effort. It's a kind of a high. You feel wide, you feel free. Of course, we see the chemical processes in the cells undergoes a change also. It begins now to convert fat into the energy source. But at that point, it is actually tapping into a wider energy. If you observe your consciousness, you feel yourself larger than your body. Your body is running, but it's as if it's running inside your own larger awareness. You feel as if you're floating. You feel as if the movement is effortless. Now this can go on quite a while, until you reach a further breaking point. At which point, if the will is driving, who is the will driving? Your mind. Your mind is driving your body. The biology can no more support, and there's an automatic breaking out into still wider consciousness, drawing upon larger resources. At that point, you have this sense, you are almost as if not moving. Your body is moving inside you. The sense of consciousness is so much wider. and you feel you're watching. But where are you? As if all around. It's not a center floating above looking at your body. It's not I in front or behind watching. It's not a point awareness looking. It's a wide awareness, aware from all directions at the same time. So the state is very strange at first because you're not used to it. We're always used to being a point looking at the universe, I look at my hand, but from point. But when I'm this whole awareness, I'm aware of my hand or my body from all directions. It feels a bit weird. You don't have words to describe it. So you're watching, but where are you? All around, everywhere, even inside, including. But not in this point inside the head, but everywhere around, equally. So that's a first breaking out into a wider consciousness. It may also happen that it involves a higher grade, but not always. It depends on the person's internal development. If a person has had a spiritual development, the freedom from the body consciousness with the wideness that it carries may also bring spontaneously a higher grade, which is his actual evolved state. When he gets back into the body consciousness and identifies with the physical mind, he may lose that, or that may act only indirectly. But when out, this is where you were actually in your evolution. This is exactly what happens when you shed the body, also known as die. So in the first action of this stepping out or the freedom from the body, there's this huge decompression, and you find yourself free in a wider, freer, observing awareness. Your body is inside, things are happening inside your own wider self. Of course, these are again reflections of your current state of evolution. But one does not need to have run 100 miles to get to that poise. The skill of the approach of the yoga is you are able to consciously disengage and come to this. And it only needs a kind of an internal concentration of attention. Things which we never do again. By habit, we are used to looking out through our senses. We don't practice separating from the physical senses, turning attention on our own awareness, and so on. But once you do that, it's a whole new world that opens out. What? I'm tempted to share an experience which happened once, just like that. And I'm reminded of that when I read this line where he says, if this state of consciousness is pushed farther, one becomes aware of a self even more remote from world existence. So something like that happened once. I was with a group of people, and we were going through a kind of a process of a guided process of meditation. And because it was a group that was interacting with probably the first time over 2 or 3 days, it was the first meeting in that sense, but we were doing it over a few days. And so we were going through that process, and I was intensely concentrated to a poise of a certain detachment that I was reasonably familiar with, but because it was a new group, I was making a special effort to push further and further. And suddenly something happened. It was as if a barrier was crossed, and there was a complete loss of all sense of form, and everything as if shimmered out of existence. The experience I can only draw analogy to when you're watching a television show, and especially in the old days when you had antennas, you are immersed in the story and suddenly the picture breaks. And that identification in the story breaks suddenly. Momentarily you realize, it's a TV show. And just everything, the picture breaks out completely. And yet you know it's there, but it's broken. Something like that. The whole universe went through a process of poof, and there was nothing momentarily. And the shock of it just threw me out from that edge, having just briefly touched, and then it threw me out. And then there was immediately this rush. If I cross over this barrier, will I come back? Will my body fall unconscious? Will I stop speaking? And the chair had no arms. They'd given me a chair where my body had to hold its balance. What if I topple over? What a scene it will make. All these things just rushed in. And so I just held that and whatever could be done. But what is interesting was that sense of waking up from a hypnosis momentarily. And after that, I found for a few months the impact remained. And somewhere 2 or 3 months down the line, I was driving in the car going to the airport, and I was just dwelling on this, the memory of the experience only. And spontaneously certain words began to form as a poem. And it formed 2 words. I tried to push it out, and then it kept repeating, and I said, okay, see where it goes, and then a 3rd line and a 4th line. And by that time I said, okay, I need to write it down. So I began to write it, and it came like this. I gave it the title, Secret Room. The secret room at the back of my attic now opens out to sky. Entry point to a world of magic. From there, the infinite I spy. I watch from there the worlds beyond, as time grows meaningless. I am lost to all the world around, absolved from all distress. Absorbed in timeless, spaceless vast, immersed in trance profound, all name and form are overpast, when being's ground is found. The world is but a myth or dream, on mighty ocean a passing gleam. It just came in that form, and it captured something of that. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Is experience of the death?
No, it is just the experience of the freedom.
Yeah.
Freedom. Yes.
Everything.
Yes. Yes.
This world is the death.
But momentarily, you see, when the illusion is broken, you realize what is meant by that word illusion. And that's why I took the analogy of the hypnosis. In hypnosis, you're not aware that you're hypnotized. You think you're normal. There's a very interesting TED talk, and I think it's called something like Hypnosis Doesn't Exist. And the guy starts by saying, he's a professional hypnotist on stage, and he starts by saying, hypnotism doesn't exist, so I want a few volunteers. Takes a few people onto stage. And then he makes half of them fall into a state of trance of hypnosis. And then he says, but hypnosis doesn't exist. So he says, okay, now you do this, then you do that. So he shows you all kinds of strange behavior under hypnosis. And then one of them, he's told, when I speak the word hypnosis, you will shout out, hypnosis is fake. And so as he's conversing with the audience, every time the word hypnosis pops up, the person steps up and says, hypnosis is fake. All kinds of strange behavior. And he gets them out of the trance and then says, so obviously hypnosis doesn't exist. It's very interesting, funnily done. But none of those people are conscious that they're under hypnosis. Their whole behavior, they're convinced, is their free choice. If you ask them, why did you say this now? Oh, I just felt like saying, I'm conscious, I'm free, I can say what I like. Except every time they hear the trigger word, they behave like this. And we don't realize that so much of our consciousness in life is just a state similar to that, mechanical hypnosis, bound in this. And once in a while you have this sense of becoming conscious, intensely conscious. Oh, I can choose my thoughts, I can choose my actions. This poise of mental witness, self-aware, even that to disengage from the identification, even momentarily, is a great step. And then to train it to remain disengaged, then your whole life becomes a poise of complete choice. That's a huge step already. And then from there to open out, to deepen out to something wider. Each is a kind of a freeing up. And the sense of freedom that comes with it is realizing when you look back at your earlier state, my God, that was a state of somnambulism. I was sleepwalking. I thought I was awake. I was just in a state of mechanical, dreamlike pattern of behavior. And so this is, Sri Aurobindo takes us actually step by step through all these degrees, mapping them out and what to do with that step and how to develop, how to integrate. Right.
Recently, maybe 2 months ago, I don't support the television. When I see the news in French, in English, I don't support it now. Now I don't. But not so long ago.
Yes.
But now it's also movie. I see the movie, Hindi movie, or English movie, is absolutely
Yes.
what I do.
So when you actually take a long time of not watching TV or cinema, after a long time, yes, you'll find if you suddenly watch a movie or spend some time with television, you will notice how much it infects you. If you have not had it for a long time, then you become conscious. Otherwise, we are so used to it, we don't realize. And so you watch a movie one day, after a long gap, and you notice all those images carry over into your dreams at night. You notice many of the energetic impulses, if it's a strong, emotional or forceful, energetic movie, you find those impulses settling in you and popping up within you. Subtly, but it's there and you notice it. And if you do this 2 or 3 days, after a while you're aware of so much clutter inside you that it takes a few days for it to fade out. It's very interesting to just observe that. And there are people who watch for several hours as children. Imagine how much they drink in, how much it molds unconsciously from inside their language, behavior, mind, values. And all the more because this flickering screen of the TV, as a flickering image, has a hypnotic effect. Clinically, the symptoms of hypnosis are dilated pupils and non-blinking state. You watch somebody watching TV, you'll find pupils are dilated and they're not blinking. You are being led by physical machinery flickering into a state of hypnosis. And then all this which you're watching is being dumped into you. If it was uplifting, inspiring, it would be a great help. If it is chaotic, disturbing, it can be a huge hindrance. But you absorb it just like that. And you watch children having watched a few movies or watched a few hours of TV will come back spontaneously repeating the vocabulary of the words they heard there. Whereas you try to teach them consciously a few words, they don't catch it. Why? Because the subconscious programming is more powerful, more quick. It bypasses the filter of your conscious mind. So Mother had referred to this. And in the early days when she allowed movies in the playground for the children, she would herself sit. She would herself ensure the movie was edited. She would herself sit, watch with them. Afterwards, many years later, there used to be one lady at the ashram. She was a very unusual woman. She would not go for the meditations, but she would go for all the movies. And she would say, Mother works stronger on us when we are watching movies because we are unconscious. And she can do whatever she wants inside us. So she preferred that. Anyway, the thing which Mother commented then was that cinema is a very powerful tool. Now, of course, that extends to television and videos available online. It's a very powerful tool for education. And she wanted it to be brought in the ambit of this spiritual consciousness, to be used as a means for assisting human evolution. She had made detailed plans for a cinema studio to be made when Auroville was started. It was, the location she had fixed was the part of Auroville which is closest to the lake estate. She had marked the location there and said this is where the studio will be formed. She had asked a cinema maker in India to commit to that, and he had promised to do it. And she was very practical. She said, how will it be funded? Because in those days it needed so much more money. Today it's accessible to everyone. And she said, right next to it, there is the best quality of clay in the whole of this region. There will be a pottery which will be run there, which will finance the cinema production. And all the plans were made down to the details. And the man who had committed to run this, to build the studio, he kind of backed out. And I think nobody else from within Auroville or the ashram took it up. So it just stayed as that. But she has put a force for that. And I see the first signs of it emerging, not just here, but even elsewhere in the world, where people are trying to use these multimedia as a means for spiritual development and awakening. So this hypnotic power of life, of the mind, of the self to be embedded in mind and in the world, is the most powerful skill of nature. You see, when we speak of soul and nature, Sri Aurobindo describes in Savitri how she creates this wonderful appearance of all this rich world, and the soul is as if fascinated and says, wow, wow, let me experience this, let me enjoy this, until it forgets who it is. It forgets that it is Lord, and it thinks that it is a product of nature. How will I survive without this? I cannot be without all these things happening around me. And it has forgotten who it is actually. And so sometimes, either by choice or by a knock, you have to wake up and say, I'm free, and I'm a free consciousness. I can choose, and I can even reshape my nature. So it's part of the awakening in the spiritual journey. So we will continue this text next Friday.